In this video, we're going to go over taxes. So taxes are price increase that the government places on a good or service. So a tax results in an increase in price, which decreases the amount of buyers according to the law of demand. Because if it's a greater price, then less people will buy it. And it also decreases the price received by sellers, because if there's less people buying it, then there's less of the good or service produced. So let's do a quick graph over here. So let's say this is the original supply and demand curve, and let's take a look at what happens from the supply perspective when there's a tax on it. So for the same amount of quantity supplied, this is the price, and this is the quantity. So this is x plus tax. So the price increased with the same amount of quantity, and what results here is that there's a new equilibrium, because with the tax implemented in the supply curve, the regular S curve is no longer existing. It's shifted up to the S plus tax curve, and that's the one that the buyers pay. So the equilibrium went from here up to here, and you can see how there's a smaller quantity demanded because the equilibrium is to the left of the original. What results in here is that because less people are going to buy it, that means less revenue is going to go to the seller, which results in the seller producing less because it's not worth it. It's not worth it for the seller to produce more than the quantity demanded, which is here. So it ends up producing the same as the quantity demanded. So let's draw this out. What results in here is that there's this excess area here that could have been used, but because the production has been cut, this potential area here is wasted, and that is called the deadweight loss. Now, before we go back to here, let's show what it looks like in the point of view of demand. So here's a supply and demand curve. So when there's a tax that occurs, the demand actually decreases because less people are going to buy it. So what results in is this is the original equilibrium. This is D minus tax. So when less people buy it, the new equilibrium is going to be over here. But normally when there's a tax, the price goes up, and that is what happens here. But in the demand perspective, it's the same thing but on a different perspective. So when the demand value decreases down to here, the supply curve's value will still be here. But you can see how the new quantity demanded is less than the original quantity supplied. So that results in the quantity of supply decreasing down as well. And that results in the same triangle here, that is the deadweight loss. That is the potential amount of resources that's wasted because of the tax. Let's take a look how consumer surplus and producer surplus are affected by this. So let me draw an original one real quick. So let's say this is the supply and demand. Without the tax, this would just be the consumer surplus. This would be the producer surplus. There's also a previous video I made called the efficiency and fairness of markets. That I think that's the one that goes over the consumer surplus and producer surplus and how to find them and what they mean and all that stuff. Same with deadweight loss as well. So if you take a look at this original equation, or if you take a look at this original graph, you can see how with the increase in tax, the consumer surplus decreases because less people are buying it, and the producer surplus also decreases as well. Now note that the producer surplus is not determined by the S plus tax curve, it's determined by the regular S curve, because the regular S curve is the amount that's actually being produced, and while in the X plus tax, the extra increase is just the money that the government places on the good. And what results in here, that is the tax revenue, TR. So this is what the government receives, and that is the price, the increase in price from here to here. I'll say it's like from $3 to $5, and is that $2 tax, the increase from 3 to 5, multiplied by how many goods or services are produced. And the same thing happens here as well. This is the tax revenue. We already wrote down what the deadweight loss is. This is the consumer surplus, and this is the producer surplus. And note that again here, the consumer surplus is based off of the regular demand curve, not the demand minus tax curve, because the consumer surplus is based off of what's actually being demanded and what's actually being bought rather than just the tax. Because the tax is just the price that the government puts on the good. Alright, now let's take a quick look at how elasticity affects the producers or the consumers. So let's take a look at this graph where the supply curve is a lot more elastic than the demand curve. So let's say that there's a tax, and so this tax creates this from the demand perspective. So what happens here is that with the increase in tax, that's where this money increases, and that results in a decrease in the quantity demanded, and the original supply curve is at the original market equilibrium, and because there is less demanded, there's less money given to the producers, so they produce less to match up, so they produce the same amount of goods as the quantity demanded. So that's where this comes from. That's the value on the supply curve going down, which reaches the market equilibrium. Yeah, let me zoom in. So let's take a look at how this tax influences the consumer and producer surplus. So this is the consumer surplus, this is the producer surplus. I'll draw out what it looks like normally and then see how the tax affects it. So it'll be an inelastic demand curve and an elastic supply. This would be the consumer surplus, and this would be the producer surplus. When we take a look at here, this triangle, that's a deadweight loss. That's how much resources is being wasted. And you can see how the part of the deadweight loss that is originally the consumer surplus is a lot greater than the producer surplus one. So what happens here is that you can see that there's a greater there's a lot more resources lost by the consumer surplus than by the producer surplus. And this makes sense because the demand curve is a lot more inelastic. So when there's an increase in tax, the demand is affected more, so the buyers pay more, and meanwhile the supply curve isn't affected that much by the tax because it's very elastic, so the price change isn't much, and that's what results in the buyers paying more in this case. Now we take a look at an inelastic supply and an elastic demand. With an increase in tax, let's take a look at it from the seller's perspective. It results in a shift of demand over here because of the increase in price, and with the smaller amount demanded over here, the supply decreases as well. So what results in here is this triangle as well. That's the deadweight loss for this, and you can see how the consumer surplus is a lot less than the producer surplus. And that makes sense because with the tax, the price change in the terms of supply is a lot greater than the price change in demand. So you can see how like the steeper the slope, the more it's being affected by the tax. So what this shows is it shows how the elasticity of the supply and demand determines the excess burden, which is the deadweight loss, which is this triangle over here. It shows how intense the excess burden tax is on firms or households. Let's just see what happens when the supply demand curve is completely inefficient. This is inelastic. So let's say this is an inelastic demand curve, and this is the supply. So when you increase the supply, this supply plus tax. This is the original market equilibrium, and this is the new one. And you can see how even with the increase in tax, the demand is still the same. So that still results in the same production of supply. And you can see how there's no way we can make a triangle here, because normally if you take a look at this one, the supply decreased, but in this case the supply stayed the same because the quantity demanded stayed the same. So in this case there's no deadweight loss being produced, and that's what makes and that results in the taxes being efficient. If either the supply or demand curve is inelastic, the price is increased, the tax is increased by its full amount. But if you take a look at if neither of them is inelastic, the tax only increases the price by only a fraction of the tax increase. Let's take a look at what it looks like here. So when you increase the price, when you put a tax on here, the supply would go up to here. This would be the increase in the tax. Let's say it's like $5 or something. But you can see how it results in a decrease in demand, which in result decreases the supply as well. So the overall tax increase is just from here up to here, and let's say that's only like $1 or something. So based on its elasticity, if it's not inelastic, the tax increase is only a fraction of what is the actual tax that's implemented. Let's take a look at what happens if one of the curves is perfectly elastic. So it's just gonna be a quick one. So let's say that this is the demand curve; it's completely elastic. Even if you increase the tax, when you increase the tax, it moves up and down in the price axis. That's the vertical one. So if you increase the tax, then in this case the demand would decrease because it's D minus tax. And because what happens here is that if there's an increase in tax, then that results in less people buying it, so it goes from here down to here, and that results in less production by the supplies, and that's shown by the decrease in quantity. So just like a brief summary here for elastic or inelastic. Because the price changes because the tax changes the price, the tax shifts the elastic curves up and down, while if it's inelastic, the tax goes along the curve, so it doesn't change the curve at all. Let's talk about how the tax is distributed between the sellers and the buyers. So in this case, for the elastic one, so I drew some points on this elastic curve to show how this tax causes some deadweight loss. You can see how with the increase in price, the demand decreases because if there's a greater price, there's less people buying it, and that results in this decrease in quantity demanded. And with that, the supply shifts down to match the quantity demanded. So what we have here, this is the consumer surplus. Meanwhile, over here is the producer surplus. So even though the consumer surplus decreased, the producer surplus is paying all the tax over here, this deadweight loss. Let's take a look at an example when this elasticity of the supply equals the elasticity of the demand. So when there's an increase in tax, there's a deadweight loss here. And because the elasticity of the supply and demand are the same, that's like saying that their slope is the same. So this value over here and this value over here, the two parts of the deadweight loss, those two are the same. There's this deadweight loss over here, there's this triangle. I'm going to zoom in over here. So because the elasticity is the same, that means the curve or the slope is the same. So what results in here is there's this tax over here, this tax increase, right? And a part of it's being paid by the producer and a part of it's paid by the buyer, or the consumer. And the cutoff is where the market equilibrium is. Anything above is by the consumer, anything below is paid by the. If these two are have the same slope, then the deadweight loss is perfectly split. So in this case, if the elasticities are the same, this part is paid by the consumer, and this part is paid by the producer. So the producer and the consumer pays the exact same if the elasticity is the same. But if you take a look at this one here, this is from this example. If the demand is more inelastic than the supply, then this part over here, the consumer pays more while the producer pays a lot less. And then in this case, if the supply curve is a lot more inelastic than the demand curve, the producer pays a lot more than the consumer. And let's take a look at one of them where where the demand curve is completely inelastic. Well, as you can see here, let's start from going here first. If they're the same, they pay the same. But the more inelastic the demand curve gets, the more the buyer has to pay. So in this case, if the demand curve is completely inelastic, then in this case, then the buyer pays for all the taxes. And because there's no deadweight loss, when the demand curve is inelastic, there's no way to actually show it. Or it's basically just all this up here. But if you could do it with the demand curve that's just like barely but not quite perfectly inelastic, and you have a supply curve over here, you can see how if you can see how it goes from here. This is the S, this S plus tax. This is the demand curve. You can see how this slight increase could result in this huge. Let me zoom in. It'll be like that. So, and this is the that's the original equilibrium. So it will result in this whole section being paid by the buyer, and this small section being paid by the seller. And let's take a look at what happens in a perfectly elastic one. In this case, the deadweight loss, that's this part over here. That's entirely like this. That's entirely the on the producer side. So as you can see over here, the more elastic the demand curve is, the less the buyer has to pay. So as you can see here, if the demand is super elastic, that means that the producer would have to pay for all of the taxes, and that's shown right here because there's barely any for the consumer. Now let's talk about how fairness relates to tax. There are two main principles in tax fairness. One is the benefits principle. This is basically you pay the same for the benefits you receive from the public goods and services. So it's basically you pay for what you get. Basically saying like if you get more benefits from goods and services, you have to pay more taxes. And the other one is called the ability to pay. This is saying you pay more if you have more. But both of these don't include the universal ideas of fairness. That is like if the rules are fair and if the results are fair. Because in the benefits principle, you pay for what you get. And in the benefits principle, it's not results fair because if you have more money, you're going to pay for more benefits. In this case, in the ability to pay, the rules aren't fair because if you have more money, you're going to have to pay more taxes. Let's go over the three different types of taxes. So there are three different types of taxes. There's the progressive, proportional, and regressive. All these are determined by the average tax rate, which is the tax over income times 100%. In terms of progressive, that is when the average tax rate increases with income. So the more income you get, the more tax you have to pay. It's not like a constant increase, it's like kind of like exponential, I guess. In the case of proportional, the average tax rate is always constant. So if you get more income, then you still have to pay more tax, but it's at a proportional amount. So that's kind of like a linear. And in the case of regressive, average tax rate decreases with income. So if the income increases, the tax doesn't increase as much. And what that results in is it kind of results in like a decay. Now let's take a look at two different proposed tax methods. The first one is called flat tax. This is a tax system with a constant average and marginal tax rate. So we just discussed what average tax rate was before, but the marginal tax rate is the percent of an additional dollar of income paid in tax. So instead of just the amount of tax over the amount of income times 100, it's the increased amount of tax over the increased amount of income times 100%. So in the marginal tax rate, it just goes over the percent increase rather than the actual value. And what the flat tax base is it's the income. And the other one is fair tax. Fair tax is the so what this is it just basically taxes the goods and services that you buy to consume, and it only applies a tax only if it's above the poverty level. So let's say this is the poverty level, everything bought under it doesn't count, but once it reaches the poverty level, it shoots up and it goes down like that. You can see how it is so the tax base for a fair tax is the expenditure on consumption goods and services. So that's what it's based off of. And like how in flat tax it's based off of the average tax rate and marginal tax rate. The tax base of flat tax, what it's based off of is the income, because both the average tax rate and marginal tax rate are based off of income. In this case, the base for fair tax would be the expenditure on consumption goods and services. And you can see how this graph can result in some issues. In the beginning, like in low income, it's progressive, especially on this part where it shoots up. But later on, it becomes recessive because as the income increases, and I don't know, let's call this the tax curve. Because the more income someone has, the smaller their percentage of money is going to be spent on buying consumption goods and services. So that's why the curve here is regressive. And this is a lot better than flat tax in terms of efficiency because there's less tax at a higher income.